for the board clerk to call for attendance.
All right, we know Director Orzali is with us and Director Wood.
Here.
Director Jones.
Here.
All right, all are present, and even Director Sailors as the alternate is here.
Excellent. So with that, we will move public opportunities to discuss matters of public interest within the committee's scope, including items on or not on the agenda. Do we have any speakers?
There were no speakers who reached out beforehand, but Art, if you could unmute all of our callers and give them a chance to speak if they so wish.
Yep, give me 1 second. Okay, attendees, you have the ability to unmute if there's anything you'd like to bring up. Now would be a great time. Looks like no response.
Fine.
Thank you very much.
Then moving on to the consent items, do I have a motion?
Mr. Chair, I'll move the consent.
And I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor? Or let the board clerk take the roll, excuse me.
Director Wood
Aye.
and Director Jones
Aye.
and Director Orzali.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Moving then to action items, the election of officers. And so, Melissa, would you like to address this?
Sure, I'll be very brief. Good evening, directors, Chief Harms. Being that this is our first Finance and Audit Committee of 2021, you have the opportunity to change or maybe leave the chair and vice chair. I want to thank Director Orzali for chairing the committee in 2020 and Director Wood for being the co-chair. I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
We hadn't really talked about this, but I'd thank Randy as well for his service. I think he's done a great job, and if he's willing to do it again, I'd nominate him for another term.
I agree.
Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all to hell. So, Melissa, at this point, what's our next item? Our next action,
I would say if we're not going to make any changes, then we don't necessarily need a motion, but you can always make a motion to leave the chair and co-chair the same.
Mr. Chair, I move that we continue our leadership as is.
I'll second that, Mr. Chair.
I have a motion and a second, and will the clerk please take the roll?
Director Wood,
Aye.
Director Jones,
Aye.
and Director Orzali.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay. With that, we can then move to our next item. And this is a presentation item, financial report through October 31, 2020 from CFO Thomas. So Amanda, take it away.
Good evening, directors. So yes, this is the financial report for the first 4 months of the current fiscal year. So it's the 4 months ended October 31st, 2020. And before I jump into the report, I just wanted to, preface with kind of a little bit of what we're seeing so far year to date this fiscal year. I mean, I think some of the trends that I'll talk about in this report are things that I talked about in the last report for the first 2 months of the fiscal year, and it's also sort of what we're seeing when we look through the first half of the fiscal year, which we don't obviously have that report for you this evening, but you'll be seeing it next month. And it's what we're evaluating when we look at our mid-year budget and what we will come to you and then to the full board with in terms of recommendations for the mid-year budget. So I think some of the big picture trends for this year where we're seeing some impacts, and I think where we can, sort of tie some of those impacts to what has gone on with the COVID pandemic and, some of the effects of that are that we are seeing our medic cost recovery revenues continuing to trend a little bit below budget, and I'll show you some of that information. And then on the other side, I think we're seeing some impacts in terms of overtime. So, we know that with the workers' comp leave that's been necessitated by some exposures and illnesses, that's driven some additional overtime costs that weren't anticipated when the budget was developed. So taking those things into consideration, really what we're looking at right now is, what are the other areas of our budget that we can adjust to get us back to a balanced budget. So I don't have all of that information for you tonight, but I just kind of wanted to let you know that, we're seeing these trends. We think the trends are consistent through the first half of the year, and those are the things that we will be addressing and you will be hearing about when we talk about mid-year budget next month. So with that, I will dive into this presentation, or I will attempt to. Doesn't want to move forward for me. Hold on just a second. There we go. Okay, so this first chart is exactly what I was just talking about. So this is looking at our mid-year, or excuse me, our medic cost recovery revenue. And just to kind of provide frame of reference, that blue line is our current year budget. So you can see we were budgeting for a total of about $43 million in revenue this fiscal year, which works out to be about $3.6 million per month. And then our red line is showing what we've actually collected. And I think when we were talking about this in August, we had talked about the fact that July we were kind of right on target, and August was below target. And I think that's sort of been the case. September and October, while they've been on target, they obviously haven't made up for the fact that we collected less in August than we would have budgeted for. So overall, we are still trending below budget in that category of revenues. We have actual collections of about $13 million. The other thing that I did want to point out on this chart is if you look at the prior year line, which is the green colored line, it looks a little bit strange when you get to June. And the reason for that is that if you'll remember, this is a revenue category where during the year we're reporting the actual amount that was collected in each period. And then when we get to the end of the fiscal year and when we're preparing our financial statements, we do an accrual to reflect how much revenue was associated with the transports that actually occurred during the fiscal year. And when we did that accrual for last fiscal year, 1920, there was a negative adjustment. Some of that was anticipated because of some one-time collections that had occurred in the beginning of the year that were really attributable to the prior year. But some of it was unanticipated. And so overall, what you see, and we're recognizing it in the chart in the June period, is that you kind of see that flattening out there because what was collected in June was offset by the negative accrual. So I wanted to point that out because it does impact our starting general fund balance, and I'll talk about that when we get to that slide. So this chart is just showing total revenues at this point in the fiscal year. So 4 months into the year, we haven't received any of our property tax revenues. So that red line trending below budget there really is reflective of what we were talking about on the prior slide. Total budgeted revenues are $239 million for the year, and we've actually collected 16 million, the majority of that being our medic revenues.
And
Yes, was there a question?
realizing that we've got kind of a perfect storm going on. And is there any real way to make projections about what's likely to happen, or is that even relevant to us anymore?
So I think we are where we are making projections is looking at our mid-year budget. You know, we have sort of the advantage of knowing what 6 months of the year is because it's done. So we know that 6 months, and then what our job is to sort of project the remaining 6 months. And what we're basing that on in large part is what did we see during the first 6 months, and do we have any information that would lead us to believe that the next 6 months might be different. So for example, for our medic cost recovery revenues, okay, we have 6 months of actual experience. Probably seems relatively likely to assume that the next 6 months will be about the same as the first 6 months. So that might be a basis for our projection. There may be other areas where we have information to suggest things will improve, or there may be other impacts that we're aware of that we weren't when the final budget was developed. So I think we have, obviously not perfect information, but we certainly have better information than we did when we were developing the preliminary and the final budget when we're talking about this fiscal year. I also think that, obviously property tax revenues represent, the largest percentage of our revenues, and we don't have any reason to believe that there will be any impact this year, just by virtue of how property taxes work. And then looking forward to next year, I think we're developing relatively sound information to be able to make those projections. So the fact that that accounts for about 2/3 of our revenue, I think, does provide it's not certainty. It somewhat, mitigates that risk of uncertainty and the things that we can't predict. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It did, and thank you for that.
Sure. Okay, so this chart is now kind of moving over to the expense side and looking at salaries and benefits expenses. So again, blue line represents the current year budget, which is about 195 million. You can see through October, we've spent about 70 million looking at that red line, and we are overall trending a little bit higher than budget. And that really is reflective of the overtime costs that I was talking about at the beginning, just being higher than what we anticipated when the budget was put together. This is an area where, we're obviously still working on the budget, but looking at the remaining 6 months, I mean, I think there's some reason to believe things might be better when we're talking about our COVID-related workers' comp exposures now that, vaccines are rolling out. I think it's, that is some information that we can take into account to say, okay, well, maybe the second half of the year, we wouldn't see as severe an impact as we did the first half of the year.
Okay. Other questions?
Oh, yes.
No, not for me. I was asking, were there other directors had questions?
No, thank you.
Okay, Amanda, please continue.
Okay. And so then what this chart is showing us are total expenditures. The budget for the fiscal year is 237 million. We have so far spent about almost 88 million of that. And what I think is interesting or important to note on this chart is that while I was talking about, salaries and benefits expenditures trending above budget, we can see here looking at this chart that we're actually kind of slightly below budget when we look at total expenditures, which is an indication that, there's some room for us to perhaps make adjustments in other areas of the budget to bring things overall into alignment. This chart is showing general fund reserves. So the green line is the current fiscal year, the red line is last fiscal year, and then the dashed yellow line represents our minimum reserve target of 15% of budgeted expenditures. So you can see, looking at the green line, as of October 31st, actually looking at both of those lines, we're negative, which is normal for us at this time of the year where we have not yet received our first installment of property tax revenues. So it was a negative $39 million balance as of October 31st. You will note on this chart that the starting balance, if you look down at the table, and then the starting balance on 7/1/20 of 33.2 million, that does reflect the audited results. So it is reflective of that negative accrual of MEDIC revenues in fiscal year 19/20. So that's a lower number than we were showing on this chart in the last report, and that's because we've now reflected that adjustment. You can see, though, even with that somewhat lower starting balance, based on our current final budget, we're still projecting a reserve at the end of the fiscal year that would be about 35.5 million, which would represent 15.3% of our current budget. This chart, unlike the previous chart, is not just showing the general fund. It's showing cash in all district held funds. Again, the green line is the current fiscal year. Like the chart that was showing the general fund reserve, we are negative at this point in the fiscal year. So we're showing a negative cash balance of 17 million. It's actually slightly better than where we were at this point in time last year, and that's really due to higher balances in some of our non-general funds. So our pension bond stabilization fund, we're making deposits every year to pay off the remaining series in 2025. So each year there's an addition to that fund that's helping bring that the green line over the red line. And then additionally, our development impact fees funds, we collected that money but not yet expended it for the construction of Station 68. So that's also contributing to a higher cash balance. But when we're in that negative period there, you'll see indicated on the chart, that's what we call dry period funding. And just like the chart that we were looking at on the previous slide for the general fund, this is the point in time in the year where we have not yet received our first installment of property tax revenues, and we are able to borrow money from the county to help fund our cash flow needs. So it's normal for our balances to be negative, and that's reflective of the fact that we're essentially, we have these cash flow borrowings that we're accessing from the county. And then the last chart that we look at is the SERP fund. So this is our OPEB, or Retiree Medical Trust Fund. As you know, this is held outside of the district, so it's not represented in any of our, in the cash chart, because it's a separate trust held outside. The balance in that trust as of October 31st was almost $53 million. And that was made up of cumulative contributions of about $41.5 million and cumulative interest earnings of a little over $11 million. So in summary, revenues are trending below budget due to MEDIC cost recovery revenue and activity being below what we expected in the budget. Expenditures overall are also actually trending slightly below budget, even though our salaries and benefits are trending over budget. And then the beginning reserve balance has been updated to reflect the audited results for fiscal year 19/20. But even with that somewhat lower starting balance, our ending reserve balance based on the final budget is expected to be 35 million, or 15% of our budgeted operating expenditures. And that concludes this presentation. I'm happy to take any additional questions.
Amanda, this is Gay, and I have a question. It's a big general question, and apologies in advance for my ignorance here. With all the different types of COVID relief, has the district been able to use to access some of those relief funds?
Yes, so that's a good question. So we were able to, last year in 1920, we received some funding from the Department of Health and Human Services from their Provider Relief Fund, which is a lot of what you hear about in terms of the CARES Act was the Coronavirus Relief Fund that went to state and local governments. This was different. This was funding for healthcare providers, but we were able to access that, and I believe we got around 800,000 from that funding source, which helped to offset some of the revenue losses that we saw, particularly in the March, April, May timeframe. So that was in fiscal year 1920. That was the largest funding source that we received. We also have submitted for reimbursement for some of our expenditures. It's FEMA reimbursement. We're actually submitting through the county. So we've not yet gotten a determination on that, but there's potential for some reimbursement of expenditures there. And then we were also successful in getting an AFG grant for some of our PPE expenditures. So that's sort of what the status of things, you know, that we know about is. I know that there's some other opportunities that will be coming that definitely will be exploring and can make that, you know, sort of part of our budget discussion as well.
No, I appreciate that. I recall the 800,000 with the CARES Act from the previous fiscal year. I was kind of curious if there was anything on the horizon, and you have answered my question. Thank you.
Sure.
And with that, are there no other questions? Amanda,
No.
thank you so much for your, go ahead, please go ahead.
No, I was saying no, Randy. Thanks.
Thank you. So with that, Amanda, thank you so much for the report. And so moving on to the next item, then this is the second item in the report. So I guess our next item is the closing of the meeting and the establishment of the next meeting for February 25th.
I actually have one more presentation.
Oh, see, I apologize. I can't.
You don't get to get rid of
see.
me that easily.
Now, I understand, Amanda, and I do apologize. I can't see. I'm seeing the then if you would go forward with the reserve funding policy.
I will. So I'm going to stop sharing this presentation and attempt to share the other one. And I think maybe while I'm doing that, I believe Chief Harms would like to say a few words.
And while that's going on, with all due respect, I'm trying to join, so I may be in and out. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you, directors. Amanda, thank you for your presentation. As Amanda said, Amanda and the exec staff have been working this past 2 weeks looking at our mid-year budget and looking at what adjustments we do need to make, and then what our predictions are for moving into the second half of the year. Next coming up is Amanda's going to talk about the reserve funding policy. I know with a lot of you, we've had some conversations about hitting kind of our baseline of 15% where we're at today, and then what we're going to do to be able to move forward. A lot of review and research has been done. The last time that the policy was updated was in 2013. So we'll review our policy, the purpose of the policy, and then bring forward really the steps and actions that we want to take to update the policy and take feedback from all of you as we move forward then. So Amanda, it is now your turn. If you can get it, there it is.
Okay. Does everybody see the reserve funding policy?
Yes.
Great. So as Chief Harm said, this is really an opportunity to kind of check in on a policy that was adopted several years ago. sort of provide an overview of what is in the policy, how are we doing in terms of compliance with the policy, and are there any adjustments that we think make sense to make at this point in time. So with that, try to jump right in here. I will go over a summary of the policy and talk about where our current, and when I say current, I mean June 30th, 2020 balances are compared to what the policy targets are. And then just talk in general, focusing in on the operating reserve. What is the purpose and history, and sort of looking in a little bit more detail at the operating reserve, and then talking through some recommended next steps. So the reserve funding policy, as was said, was adopted in August of 2013. And it actually addresses 9 separate reserves, including the general fund operating reserve. And it establishes minimum and maximum target reserve levels for each one of those 9 separate reserves. And really the idea, I think, behind the minimum and the maximums are really established to sort of protect against the need to reduce service levels, right? So let's have a minimum amount so that we can meet any foreseeable obligations, help mitigate risks, so that we're able to not impact service levels when there are funding challenges, or not impact them as much. And then the maximum targets are really there to ensure that only the necessary reserves are accumulated. The policy is really laid out in terms of categorizing the different types of reserves. So in the first broad category, we have what's called unassigned fund balance. And that's basically that's fund balance or reserve that has the least restrictions on what it can be used for. And the reserve that we have in the policy in this category is the general fund operating reserve. So what we normally think of as our general fund reserve. And then the next category is what's called committed fund balance. And those are funds where the board has made decisions to commit those funds or those reserves for only certain purposes. So there isn't any other legal restriction on their use, but there's a commitment that's been made by an act of the board. So within this category, we have our workers' comp self-insurance reserve. The policy also talks about a compensated absence reserve, capital replacement reserves, and an early debt extinguishment reserve. And I will talk more about each one of these when we get into what the current balances are. I'll kind of explain how the minimums and maximums are established. But right now, just sort of providing an overview. So the next category are restricted reserves, and these are funds that are legally restricted in their use. So there's some external restriction placed on how we can use these funds. In that category, we have what the policy calls the capital improvement program reserves, but that's our development impact fees. So as you know, there's a legal restriction on those funds, and they can only be used to pay for the construction and equipping of new fire stations. We also have debt service reserve associated with our lease revenue bonds. So that's an amount that required by the bond indenture to be set aside, and those funds could only be used to pay debt service on those bonds. And then the policy also speaks to a deferred compensation plan fiduciary reserve. This is an area where, I think we've identified that the policy really needs to be updated to sort of reflect the current reality. So that reserve actually no longer exists. It was the deferred comp reserve is now held by the deferred comp plan administrator, and that occurred by action of the board, I believe in 2017 or 2016, excuse me. And then finally, the policy talks about the the category of trust fund, and then the trust fund that we have, which I talked about in the previous presentation, is our post-retirement medical, or the SERPT fund. So those are the 9 different reserves that the policy addresses. And then on this table, we're really looking at what are the minimum and maximum targets for each of those reserves. And I've excluded the deferred comp reserve from this just because it doesn't actually exist any longer. So this is looking at the 8 others. And then what's the balance, or what was the balance as of June 30th? And were we in compliance with the policy based on that balance? So the first line is our operating reserve. And you can see, I think as everyone is familiar with, that the minimum target established by the policy is 15% of the general fund operating expenditures. So looking at fiscal year 19-20, that 15% minimum target equated to 33.2 million. The maximum that the policy establishes is 50%, which would have been 110.7 million. And then our balance as of June 30, 20 was 33.2 million. So really right on that 15% minimum target. And so we were in compliance with the policy. So that kind of, that framework sort of follows for each of the other reserves, where we have a minimum established and a maximum established. I'm showing on this table what those dollar amounts were for as of June 30, 20, but as I walk through this, I'll explain how the policy says we derive those minimum and maximum targets. So for the workers' comp self-insurance reserve, the policy minimum is the short-term liability for workers' comp, which was 4.1 million. The maximum is the long-term liability, which is 22.2. We had a balance of 4.2 million, so we were in compliance. And just to help clarify, so that 4.2 million is in addition to the 33.2 that you see above, because this is a committed reserve, which is separate from our unassigned fund balance and our general reserve of where we're doing that, where we're looking to see if we're between 15 and 50%. The third line down, compensated absence. This one is an interesting one. This was written into the policy, but even in the policy and how the policy anticipated, it really is something that ends up getting budgeted and expended every year, but has never really been established and held as a separate reserve. So when we talk about compensated absences, we're talking about vacation and sick leave accruals, and what is the value of those accruals, and the amounts that could either be cashed out or used as leave. So the policy talks about establishing as a minimum target the amount that's expected to be used or paid out within a 12-month period, and then the maximum being the total obligation. So those minimum and maximum targets equated to 4.3 million and 13.7 million. However, as I mentioned, there's never actually been a reserve established for this purpose, and it's really always been the district's practice to budget for the annual payouts, and that's essentially what the policy anticipates. I think that practice really has worked fine, and I think that this may be an area where something was written into the policy in a way that didn't necessarily align with how our budgeting had actually worked. And this is probably also another area where perhaps we can go in and sort of modify the policy to reflect that this isn't a reserve that's established, but it is something that gets built into our annual budget. The next line down is the capital replacement. And this really, the purpose of this reserve is to be able to replace existing infrastructure upon the end of its useful life. And so the policy establishes a minimum target for this reserve of of the annual depreciation, which was $5.8 million for 1920, and then a maximum target being the total accumulated depreciation, which is 68.4. And you can see that with a balance as of 1.9 million as of June 30th, 20, this is an area where we are not in compliance with the policy. And I think it's also just from a practical standpoint, an area where, I think there's recognition that we've sort of during the previous recession kind of fell behind in terms of capital replacement. And this is come budget time every year, probably an area where we're experiencing challenges being able to provide the funding needed to replace equipment and make other capital replacement investments. And I think, this is an area where our lack of compliance with the policy, we really are seeing an operational impact, and this probably should be a goal for us to be able to get into compliance with the policy in this area. The next line is the early debt extinguishment, and this is related to paying off of the pension obligation bonds. And this policy, when it was written, I think was written to align with the pension bond early payoff policy as it existed at the time. That separate policy has subsequently been revised to kind of better account for the differences between actual and assumed investment earnings in that fund. So this is probably another area where the reserve policy needs to be modified to align with the current pension bond early payoff policy. So according to the current reserve policy, we should have a minimum target balance of 5.6 million. However, our existing balance, which complies with the revised pension funding bond early payoff policy, is 4.7 million. So I think we're sort of in compliance and on target to pay off those bonds, just not in the way originally envisioned. And so we just need to make some modifications to the reserve policy to reflect that. Next category, capital improvement program. Those are the development impact fees that I talked about. So the policy establishes a minimum target of 10% of the current year budget for the use of development impact fees, and then a maximum target, which was $700,000, and then the maximum target would be the total capital improvement program, so the total amount expected to be spent on new fire stations and equipment for new fire stations, and through 2040, the dollar amount associated with that is $380 million. We had a balance as of 6/30 of $7 million, so we were in with this policy. The debt service reserve, I talked about that we are in compliance with. Is there a question?
You need to mute yourself.
And we're in compliance with that at about 700,000. And then finally, the SERP fund.
Have you restarted your
Art, we can hear
iPad
you.
by chance?
The SERP fund is the minimum target is the cumulative actuarial contributions and interest earnings. The maximum target is the total liability, and we are at 49.3 million. We're in compliance because we have over time contributed the actuarial contributions and obviously earned interest on those. So that's kind of a summary of all of the reserves that are identified in the policy and where we stand with regard to each one of those. Let's see if I can get myself to move forward here. Okay. So looking a little bit more specifically, though, at that top line, which is the general fund operating reserve, and what we tend to mean when we talk about reserves, and why do we have that? Why do agencies have it? What is it there for? I think there are two main purposes that reserve exists. And for many agencies, operating reserves are needed for cash flow purposes. So when we were looking at the general fund reserve chart and the total cash charts in the earlier presentation, that you saw that there is a period in the year where we are negative, and we can do that because we have access to this county dry period funding. So that really meets our cash flow need because we have that access. However, this policy, because it has the 15% to 50% range, one of the things that it recognizes is that at that 50% maximum reserve target, that really would allow for fiscal independence. In other words, not needing to rely on those borrowings. That would provide a sufficient balance so that we would be able to meet our cash flow needs during the year and not have to access borrowing. So that's part of the thinking behind the 50%. But I do want to stress that because we do have access to the dry period funding, the cash flow need probably isn't as significant for us as it may be for other agencies. The other main purpose is, quote unquote, rainy day reserves. So it is a source of funding that's available to help weather economic cycles. So we can't predict when the next recession is going to happen, how bad it's going to be, how long it's going to last, but we can predict that there will be a recession and it will have a negative impact on our property tax revenues. And this would be a tool to help deal with that. And then just in addition to normal economic cycles, there could be, other interruption in revenues or unanticipated expenses that a reserve does become a helpful tool to help address. So what is the right level for the general fund reserve? So there's obviously not one single answer to that question, but there are some recommendations, and on this slide I'm really referencing recommendations from the Government Finance Officers Association, so GFOA. And really, what they say is that the appropriate level needs to take into account the individual circumstances, for each government. So there's not one, a one size fits all answer. They do say that a 2-month minimum is recommended for general purpose governments. Now, we're not a general purpose government, but I think this is, sort of a way of checking in on that 15% minimum. So 15% equates to about 1.8 months, so very close to this 2-month minimum. So it's kind of a nice check that's sort of in line with what that recommendation would be. But other factors that they recommend considering in determining the target levels are, what's the predictability of revenues and volatility of expenditures, exposure to significant one-time outlays. So we do have, and that's probably that's something that we see when we look at that workers' comp self-insurance reserve, right? We know we have some exposure there because we were self-insured, but we have insurance in other areas that maybe protects us from these one-time general outlays. Impact of other funds. So all of those, the 8 reserves that we went through, and you can see the impact of maybe the capital fund relative to the general fund. Impact on bond ratings and borrowing costs. So while not insignificant, I mean, I think this is probably not high on the list for us because we are not, we're not frequently in the bond market. We probably don't have as much exposure to borrowing costs as maybe some other agencies would. And then commitments and assignments. So again, looking at, so we have commitments for our workers' comp reserve and maybe some of our other reserves. And does that mean that perhaps we don't need as much in our general reserve because we have these other commitments and assignments? So this chart is showing us what the general fund operating reserve has been historically. So going back to 2004-05, and this is just showing the ending balance for the reserve. So what's being represented by the red bars is the actual dollar amount balance, and you can refer to the left axis for that. And then shown here with the blue line is what does that dollar amount represent as a percentage of the operating budget. And what's interesting, I think, is if you look the $33 million today is roughly 15% of the budget. If you look at the left-hand side of the chart, 15% of the budget in 2004-05 was only about $19 million. And I think so establishing that percentage is a helpful way of making sure that you know, you're adequately taking into account the risk, the increasing risk, you know, with higher dollar amounts and not sticking to a flat static dollar amount. You can see I've shown in that green dashed line what the minimum percentage target has been since the policy was adopted in 2013. So that's that 15%. And that, you know, we have recently reached that minimum target amount. And thinking about, you know, what are the reasons that we have a reserve? I think, you know, the most obvious is, as I mentioned, the fact that we are exposed to economic downturns, primarily in terms of what the impact would be on property tax revenues. And I think what's interesting, if you look at this chart, so 2007-08 here was basically the first year before the district experienced some revenue declines as a result of the recession. And it really took from, you know, 2008-09 was the first year of that through 2013-14 until revenues recovered to their 2007-08 level. And over that period of time, the amount of revenue loss was about $50 million. And you can see that the reserve balance at the start of that, so before the revenue started to decline in 2007-08, was 12 million. And so that really, you know, that was 12 million that was theoretically available to meet a $50 million shortfall. But if you think about if instead, if that 15% target had existed and had, you know, and the district had been in compliance with that 15% target, that would have provided, you know, closer to $24 million, which would have been roughly half the revenue loss experienced. And thinking about, you know, the worst recession in modern history, having been able to have at least half of the revenue that was lost during that period available as a tool to kind of help manage through the budgets in those years. I mean, I think that's a nice check for us that's probably a pretty good minimum target. It's not, you know, not 100% of the worst case scenario, but would have been, I think, you know, a significant percentage to sort of help weather that storm. So I think kind of looking at the history here is another way of sort of checking in on this policy to see, is that 15% as a minimum, does that make sense? Oops, and I forgot to highlight the period of time that I was talking about, but there it is, 8-9 through 12-13. So just looking quickly at some sort of next steps, I think what I would like to recommend is that we make some modifications to the policy, some of the things that I talked about that probably can be removed or revised. So the deferred comp and compensated absences, and also looking at, you know, getting the pension obligation bond sort of aligned with the current policy for that. And then the revised policy document would be brought back to the Finance Committee at our meeting next month for your review. And then following that would have a review by Policy Committee and then ultimately the board. So that's, you know, from a policy standpoint, what I would recommend. And then I think within that policy framework, what our budgetary goals really would be to maintain at a minimum that 15% operating reserve, but then secondarily to try to achieve that minimum capital replacement reserve where we are out of compliance right now. And once that's been achieved, to work towards enhancing the operating reserve within that 15 to 50% range that's already established in the policy. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
So we did lose Director Orzelli. He's having some connection issues. Director Wood, Director Jones, do either of you have questions for Amanda?
No, crystal clear as always. Appreciate it, Amanda.
Thank you.
My only comment is, will you and your staff be revising the policy to be given to us next month, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay. I agree that 15% is really a minimum. And I also acknowledge that we got to be able to replace our equipment in a timely manner. And a lot of that has been not hopscotch, but we rely on the bulk purchasing as a regional or state level type of partnership. My only concern is that I wish we'd get I'd like to see more than 15%. But I acknowledge, I don't know if we could deal with 1 and 2 together at the same time or not. Anyway, that's just my brainstorming thoughts. You know, I'm trying to think about when we might have overages, even if they're one time or recurring overages, and how we can put them in. Do you anticipate? I don't mean this slightly. Do you anticipate additional revenues coming in that we might not have accounted for?
Well, I think we may have a, sort of a clearer picture of at least where things stand for this year when we're talking to you about mid-year budget, which would be at next month's meeting. But I think, I think when we think about the policy, really, we want to ensure that it's sort of providing the framework to allow us to meet these targets, not knowing specifically, what, in terms of what the revenue is going to be each year, but that we're establishing the targets. And then, as I'm trying to show on this slide, within those targets, maybe setting ourselves some priorities. So maintaining where we are with the general fund reserve, getting to where we need to be with the capital replacement reserve. And then once we're in compliance with everything, working to enhance that operating reserve within the 15 to 50% framework. And I think all of that's provided for in the policy.
Yeah. Okay, well, we can talk offline about the particulars for achieving the minimum capital replacement reserve. So I'm kind of curious how we're going to get that. What's going on in my mind is the particular contracts in the mid 2000s, and then we had the bottom dropout with the property tax, and then we had the more than once a recalculating of certain pension obligations for predecessor agencies. And then we have that similar thing with the PERS recalculation on their investment return. And I know it's a gloomy day, and I don't really mean to be gloomy, but those are the thoughts that are going through my head when I think about, let's get some more reserves going. All right, that's my soapbox. Thanks.
Okay.
But Director Jones, I think you are right, is that as you look at this over the period of time and you put it all down, you look at that curve, and really, while our revenue has gone up, that we're trying still to catch up from some of those expenses or those expenditures that were not there. And I the way I look at it is that as long as we can continue to make good progress forward on making sure that our fleet and making sure that there is those investments that are going on, that we're able to provide service. But I mean, we are really not investing or able to do much with our facilities. And so, I mean, there's a number of things, but I think what we've been able to do is slowly bring that back up to a level now and balanced with the other demands that we have on us. And I really do, with updating the policy, I think that puts us on a path to continue forward then.
Here. Carry on. Thanks, Chief.
All right, thank you very much for your comments and questions, Director Jones. And Amanda, we'll look forward to seeing that revised policy at our next committee meeting. Seeing there's no further action, I will go ahead and adjourn this meeting on behalf of Director Orzali. Thank you.
Okay, meeting's adjourned. Now, Melissa, we should